Hi, this is Julie. Before we get started with this week's episode, I want to tell you that applications are open until September 10th for the in-person Mother's Quest Circle pilot. If you live in the Bay Area and you think you might be one of the 10 women I'm holding space for, visit the coaching page at mothersquest.com to learn more or follow the link in the show notes to apply. If you're not in the Bay Area, you can sign up to be notified when the first virtual pilot opens in the new year. Now, on to this important episode, Courageous Conversation About Race with Nicole Lee. Hi, and welcome to Mother's Quest, a podcast for moms like me ready to live our own truly epic life. I'm Julie Neal, a life and leadership coach, community builder, writer, and mom to two high-energy boys who challenge me to grow into my best self. I'll be right there. Where was I? In the months leading up to a big milestone birthday, I decided it was time to stop sidelining my dreams and realize that I'm the hero of my own journey. I knew I didn't want to do it alone, so I created this podcast to learn from other moms on their own quest, so their words of wisdom and lessons learned could help light the way for mine. I created this podcast for myself. Come along with me, and you'll find some treasures of your own. Hello, and welcome to episode number 27 of the Mother's Quest podcast, and the first of several I'll be sharing for an initiative I've launched called Women Podcasters in Solidarity. The initiative is a commitment I've made alongside some other amazing women podcasters to raise awareness and dollars to uncover and dismantle the ways racism, both conscious and unconscious, are impacting our society. I planned the initiative after viewing the haunting video of Philando Castile's death and of his girlfriend Diamond Reynolds and her young daughter in the back of the cop car in its aftermath. But the events of Charlottesville since then have brought another level of urgency to this effort. I'm so grateful that I found Nicole Lee, an incredible African-American woman and mother, as our first guest on this topic, to light the way for how we as mothers, and especially those of us who are white women like myself, can take steps to make a difference, beginning with our own children and our own communities. Nicole is a strategist, executive coach, and public policy advocate through her diversity and inclusion consulting firm, Lee Bayard Group, LLC. And she's a practicing human rights attorney through the Black Movement Law Project she co-founded, which provides legal and strategy assistance to Black Lives Matter protesters and organizations. Social justice and human rights have been part of her character since she was a child, where she got her pioneering spirit from her own mother, one of the first Black women to be ordained in her Christian denomination. Nicole brings her experience as a mother and advocate to training parents in how to have courageous conversations with our children about diversity, inclusion, and equity. I had the opportunity to learn from Nicole on a recent webinar on the subject, an overview of a more detailed class she's getting ready to offer. The webinar was also attended by Mallory Slabo, who offers this week's dedication.
Hi. My name is Mallory Slabo, and I just wanted to thank Julie for allowing me to dedicate this episode. As I say this, I'm sitting outside on a porch, as you may be able to hear, in Myrtle's Beach on a wicker rocking chair, just blocks down from the ocean, and it's raining today. But I'm on a girls-only weekend with my favorite girl to go beaching with, as my 4-year-old calls it, my mother. Like so many other white upper-middle-class mothers across the country, appalled by the disgusting acts of violence, hatred, and racism, I've struggled with how to shape the attitudes and beliefs and the backbone to do what's right with my own 4 children. So when I was able to hear Nicole Lee speak on how to have frank discussions that are honest and true and oh so important with our kids about really hard things like race, gender, and even disability, it simplified how to begin having those conversations on each of their level. My mother stalks my Facebook page, as some of yours may too, so it was interesting when she read my post about Nicole's webinar and the takeaways that I felt everyone should be privy to, and then got texts from her friends about what I wrote as well. That post was the opening for me to begin having hard conversations with people of all ages, shapes, sizes, colors from my own circle about these hard things. As Nicole mentioned, it's not something new to our generation. It's hard for all generations to figure out how to speak out about hard things. But we've clearly seen what it does in this country when you remain silent. So this episode is dedicated to my mother, who allows me to have the hard conversations even now with her, who encourages me to be someone who stands up for what's right at all times and to go chase my dreams, and who is my best girl in the world to hang out with. Love you, Mama.
Thank you, Mallory, for that dedication and for your determination to start conversations with your own mother, children, and circle. Nicole and I start our episode with shared agreements and intentions for courageous conversation with one another, committing to each other to come to the podcast recording with an open heart, a commitment to move through discomfort and risk imperfection. I vowed not to edit anything out, and we both named a shared desire to plant seeds in mothers to raise awareness for themselves and their children. We explored how we can open channels of communication with our children, holding a growth mindset for them in relation to diversity, allowing them to make mistakes as they share what's on their minds and not shushing them when they do make a mistake. Nicole also shared the importance of expressing our values to our children in ways that they understand. When I asked her where we could invest in change, she challenged us to focus on our own communities and to identify some hard conversations we've been putting off. She emphasized the importance of introspective work to realize what's in our own way, determine what we need to be ready, and then go get ready and have those conversations. I committed to doing this work and to having Nicole join us to continue the conversation and give me an opportunity to check in on my progress in the private Mother's Quest Facebook group. She'll be joining us on Wednesday, September 13th at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. As it has been for me, I hope this podcast episode and the links and resources in the show notes will be part of what you need to get ready to have the brave conversations with your own children and your own communities. As Nicole says at the end of our conversation, we've got this. We are not being asked to do anything that is not within our grasp. It's not easy, but we can get it done. I'm Julie Neal, and this is Mother's Quest. So Nicole, welcome to the Mother's Quest podcast. It's an honor and such a gift really to have you here for this conversation.
Thanks, Julie.
Before we hit record, you and I both shared that we would be open to making some agreements live as part of the recording. I often do this with my guests before we begin, but I feel like the act of making some agreements for this conversation, at least on my end, could really be instructive for other people listening. And so I wanted to do it, for others to be part of as well. So thanks for saying yes to that.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good, productive, healthy way to begin a lot of conversations where we feel like we may need to go to some places we're not used to going to.
Yes. So first of all, Mother's Quest has already had some of the gift of connection with you. We got to feature you as a mother on a quest on our blog and then share about a webinar that you had. And the webinar title was about how to have courageous conversation with our children. And that expression about courageous conversation has really been in my mind and heart this morning in terms of the intention that I want to bring to this podcast interview. So I'm curious from an adult perspective, because I know you do this work, what do you think would help us to be able to have a courageous conversation together?
A part of it is coming to the conversation with an open heart, which is a lot harder than we often think it'll be. A part of it is so many of us have had fairly dysfunctional conversations about difference and about who we are. And we have left conversations not feeling affirmed, not feeling like our intentions were heard. And sometimes our intentions aren't heard because that's not what we've said. But that residual effect makes it really difficult to often have an open heart. But to the extent that we can, every party needs to come to a conversation with an open heart and to be really clear also in what we think the intentions of the other person are. Sometimes we do go into conversations with people where we know their intention is to harm and hurt. And unfortunately, that is the reality in our society right now. And there are times, not all the time, but there are times where we do have to still enter into conversation with people, knowing that that is what their intention is. But really being clear and being able to articulate what we think the intention is. For this conversation, I believe the intention is so positive, and it's a opportunity for us to grow and really learn more about each other and to share with the listeners, kind of some of the things that we have experienced and we understand, not to make that the universal experience, but just to really share and to kind of put it into the body politic. And so I think that's really important too, to know the intentions of when you're walking into a conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'm naturally curious then about, from the connection you and I have had, what you think my intention is.
Well, like I said, I think the intention is really positive, and it's an intention to ensure that we have closer communication, closer connection around fairly difficult conversations. I remember in our first conversation, one of the cues for me was frankly how open you were to talking about both the triumphs, some of the conversations that you've had and the quest you've been on to learn more around issues of inclusion in our country, but also some of the challenges that you've faced. And that really helped me kind of understand where I could be of help or a part of this walk for you and this, this journey for you. And that's always important. I think oftentimes we forget that people need often to understand, like, what is their place in a conversation? What are they there for? And are they comfortable with that? And we give those cues in what we say and what we're willing to share, where we're willing to be vulnerable.
Yes, I really appreciated your openness when we had that first conversation as well. And just to name one of the things that I have been struggling with as I've started to walk down this path of being more open and vocal about my exploration with white privilege and racism and wanting to become a better ally. One thing I've struggled with is learning about, when I think this is a very common thing that, not to speak for all white women, but I think, often when we feel like we've had sort of an awakening and we want to learn more, we reach out to Black women who we may know, and we want to learn from them. And that has a cost, I think, to a lot of women who feel like they then feel like it's their job to educate us. And many are, not as open as you were about wanting to be in conversation. And it can feel like we're sort of blocked on a step to learning. And it's so funny, as I'm even saying this right now, I already am feeling like I'm just going to say things wrong.
So your cheeks are getting red and hot, and it's probably like going down that moment where you feel like, oh my gosh, I've really said the wrong thing, or how I'm being perceived is in a way that wasn't my intent, kind of like that.
Yeah, exactly. And, before you and I pressed record, I also made a commitment that I wasn't going to edit the conversation, because I think that's part of the problem. It's wanting to make it all look perfect and not just admit that, like, when you step into this and you are learning, you are going to make mistakes.
No, sure.
So, and stop talking.
But I appreciate your willingness to say this, because this is a phenomenon that's happening in our society, and it's a phenomenon that's happening between women. And I think that it's important, frankly, to address it. I mean, so here's a part of the issue. A part of the issue is, if you think about, I'm a 41-year-old African-American woman. My experiences with race and racism are deep and long for all kinds of reasons. And I think for most Black women of my age group, whether or not they talk about it, whether or not it's something, if you are their friend, but you are not a Black person, you may not be hearing about it. It runs really deep. And for most of us, it started from childhood, where we experienced everything from out and out racism to microaggressions that chipped away at us. And it's that trauma that often is the reason why some Black women will say, I'm actually not here to educate you. I'm not here to help you learn. It's almost like some of it's been there, done that. I can remember times in my 20s where I would have a really good friend I thought was a really good friend, and then some issue of race would come up and they would completely abandon me. And that's a part of my history, and that's a part of my experience. Now, for some people, that's kind of where their experiences begin and end. I have been privileged and blessed to do so much work around these issues that I've been able to heal from some of that. And so I can see ways to get into conversations that may not be innately comfortable for me. But for a lot of Black women, there is just a lot of work that they have already put out into the universe, if you will, around these issues. And it's hard, it's often when you talk to older people, they'll say, oh, we were trying to tell young people this or that for years and they didn't listen. And now you want to listen. There's also a little bit of that too. The realities that people are waking up to are things that Black folks have been living, for generation and generation and generation. And so there's that part of it. On the other side, though, what I'm seeing, though, is one, genuine interest, right? So genuine interest from white folks to really learn about other people's experiences. Maybe not the skills, not the language, right? Mm-hmm. To fully embrace and understand. And there needs to be spaces for that to happen. And sometimes the spaces aren't like the PTA barbecue, right? Sometimes that's not the space to walk up to the one Black friend you've had and say, hey, so I've been, reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' book and I want to talk to you. That may not be the space. That may not be the place, but really seeking out spaces, both for white women to talk with white women, because I think that's very important about white privilege and those issues, but then also really thinking about what do your genuine, authentic friendships with Black women look like? Like, what are they? So statistically, we know that most white people don't actually have that Black friend that everybody says they have. Not a real friend. They might have a Facebook friend. They might have a friend of a friend, but it's not someone who's coming over to your house and having dinner. That has a real impact on your ability to understand what's going on in the country right now. It also has a real impact on your children. And folks don't realize that. I meet so many people who tell me they want their children to have a multicultural, multiracial friend set. They want them to go to a multiracial, multicultural school because they believe that that will enrich their lives and that will make sure that their children end up in a place where they can be friends, quote unquote, with anyone and everyone. And yet what the research shows us is that by junior high, children's friend groups actually begin to just mirror the friend groups of their parents. So you can put your child in the most multicultural setting in the world, but if you don't have real authentic friendships with people of color, your children are actually just going to mirror your behavior. And there's all sorts of developmental reasons why they do that. And they do that in other ways as well. Even though it doesn't feel like they're listening in junior high, they're actually really listening. And they're also really watching. And so, in thinking about that and thinking about how we get the information, we have to make sure when we're talking about issues of race and when we want to hear the experiences of others, that it's not transactional, right? That it can't be just that, oh, I need to understand this more, so I'm going to go, talk to my human encyclopedia of all things about race.
Yeah.
That doesn't work. Just like it wouldn't work with a transgender friend, just like it wouldn't work if you had a gay or lesbian friend and you wanted to understand that experience. It actually has to be a real friendship. So it can't just be talking about, what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. It also has to be talking about what you're making for dinner and what they're making for dinner and what's going on in their lives. And because we all, regardless of the identity burdens that we face, there's also some, real reality stuff that goes on in people's everyday lives that also has to be considered.
So much of what you're saying resonates, an ongoing unfolding of a relationship that I have with Genji Heiston, who was on my podcast in season 1. And I think you listened to that episode too.
I did.
And we were saying the same thing about, just noticing that even though we had connection with one another, our children didn't have an experience of being in one another's presence. And we made a commitment and have started to shift that. But it is a relationship that's unfolding, and we're still having, sometimes uncomfortable, but really honest conversations with one another as we're developing a friendship.
And isn't that what you do in all friendships? Like, you get to a point in a friendship where, you're having conversations and that they're not comfortable. And the question is, how committed are you to that friendship that you're willing to stick and stay? And it's interesting because as a Black woman, I can tell you that I've had friendships with white women that have died. And some of them were quick deaths and some of them are really slow, painful deaths, but have died on the basis of not being able to see the full me. Colorblindness is not a virtue. It's actually a real demon in our society. when you do not see who someone is on the basis of their experiences. And for in this country, for Black folks, many of our experiences have to do with race. Many of our negative experiences have to do with race. If one is not strong enough to go there with a friend, and I've had clients who told me, like, I loved my friend, but it was just so painful to watch. You're not willing to stick in those times. Yeah, those are where, the friendships end. So I think it's so important to be able to dig in and have those tough conversations.
So I appreciated this, what we've explored already. And so in the way of agreements, I think one, both of us committing to the conversation with an open heart, being truly curious and holding what one another's intention is, being okay, particularly on my end, with imperfection and making mistakes and learning from it, and just sticking in the discomfort as we're moving through the conversation. I did want to ask you one more thing about your intention. How can this conversation be something that is helpful or useful to you or serves you in the work that you're doing?
It's interesting because I find that the more I do work around diversity and inclusion, the more I believe that mothers are really key and to a level of transformation in our society where we can see some real gains. Not to say that school desegregation and voting rights aren't real gains, but there's a part, obviously, that we haven't solved in terms of racism and homophobia and sexism. And that is really what is in people's hearts and what people believe and what people perceive. And mothers are so crucial in really planting the seeds that grow into children, teenagers, and adults that really do have major impacts on the world. I think about Heather Heyer, the young woman who died in Charlottesville a few weeks ago. And, her mother has said repeatedly that she's not political, and she didn't actually agree with everything that Heather said. But there must have been some seeds. There must have been some things that were planted in Heather to take such courageous steps. And I think that to the best of our ability, the greatest thing about motherhood is that most people, and I would say 90% of mothers, do the very best they can do in mothering. There's no other vocation, if you will, where people have this 90% effectiveness rate, at least. And when I say effectiveness rate, I mean into their ability. Many of us had mothers that were not able to provide everything that we needed, but most certainly try. And so I think for me, having this conversation, what I'm really hoping to get out of it is just a further kind of another data point, another benchmark down the road as we look at how moms can really help transform our society.
Yeah. I think that's where you and I both meet in our intention, is the hope that we're going to, in this conversation, plant some seeds to really help mothers and therefore help them bring more knowledge and more awareness to their children.
Definitely.
So let's jump in. This is going to be a little bit of a different conversation than I typically have on the podcast. I've shared with you that Mother's Quest is about living our, what I call our epic lives, where we're the author of our story. We realize as moms that we can, pursue our own passions and dreams and invest in care in ourselves, and that actually it will help us be more powerful moms. And I usually ask my guests about these epic guideposts and how they're showing up in their life. But today I want to hear a little bit about, how you grew up and what shaped you, but then we're going to dive into the epic guideposts with the lens around diversity and inclusion and how we as mothers, can raise our children in a more open and aware way to be allies and champions. So let's start first with a little bit that will help us understand your upbringing. Tell us a little bit about how you grew up, the impact your mom had in shaping who you are, and how that connects to the quest that you're on today.
Sure. So I grew up, at least where I lived, I had a very different experience than a lot of children that I knew. So I grew up with a mother and a father who were married. However, my mother was an ordained minister. She was one of the first African-American women ordained in the Assemblies of God, which is a Pentecostal kind of evangelical denomination. And she always felt called to be a minister. And when she was ordained, she actually decided that her real calling was to spend a significant amount of time internationally. So she worked in countries in Africa, all over Africa. She worked in China. I remember my father being really frustrated with her for smuggling Bibles into China at one point. I'm just really worried about her safety. But she really felt that that was her calling and pursued it with a level of zeal I actually have never witnessed in anyone else. And I think that that definitely was very informative for me. I definitely learned from what I saw my mother doing that you can have a passion and you can follow that passion and do that work. I think what also was challenging growing up is that I did not have a very present mother. And so much of my childhood I spent with my father, who was an amazing person, a grounding person. He really provided a lot of foundational, just real truths for me. Things like absolutely respecting other people and not just saying you have values, but living your values, hard work. My dad comes from a very interesting background, especially racially, but had a real strong sense that he was raising two African-American daughters and wanted us to feel that we were empowered to do anything. And so that had a major impact on me. And it's interesting because when I talk with women who were raised by fathers, it's an interesting phenomenon. I can't quite put it into words, but there definitely is a level of kinship there that I think we have to do a bit more of exploring. And yet my mother still, in many, many ways, remains even when I don't see it coming at me, a lot of my decisions, a lot of my thoughts about my values, how I value my work, how I value my place in the world definitely comes from her. Also, a complicating factor is that my mother is very, very conservative. So the Assemblies of God Church tends to be a more conservative church, votes Republican. I remember my mother, handing out flyers for Pat Robertson when he ran for president and being really excited about his candidacy. And yet there's always this wedge, if you will, or just a difference in how I saw the world and how she saw the world. And so being so similar and yet having these very, very different worldviews in some ways really shored me up to deal with conflict. And you can imagine the conflict that took place and takes place still. But also, let me know that sometimes you do have to march to your own drummer. And I think that my mother being such a strong personality and also, as I said, such a zealous person and really seeing her position as being the position, it really challenged me to not only just argue, if you will, like in teenage years to argue, but really have my facts straight, really understand what I was talking about, really making sure that I was right, that my arguments were correct. And so that's been definitely formative for me. As I've gone on and had my own children, also my relationship with my mother has also ensured balance is something that I'm always really thinking about. So I love my work. I'm passionate about my work. I think my work is important. But I also know what it is like not to have a present mother. And so I've done many, many things since I've had children that some that have affected my career probably in some people's minds negatively to make sure that I'm fully present for my children. Because I know for me, that's something that I felt that I miss.
How does that passion that you have for your work show up in what you are doing today? Like, how are you manifesting your own passion and the seeds that your mom planted in really showing up in a powerful way in the world?
Yeah, I've definitely gone through different phases in my work. Social justice is something that I've always been very much committed to. And, I spent my teenage years and my early 20s really preparing myself to do that work. I was very interested in doing international human rights work, although I worked domestically and I organized domestically everything from clinic escorts at reproductive health centers in poor and low-income communities in my hometown, to working on political campaigns, to really, really studying, frankly, very, very hard in undergrad and in law school while working to put myself through it, because I just believe that that preparation would be so important to me in the field. And then I worked in the international human rights field for over 15 years and saw that social justice work as being critical, not the only work that was being done, but critical, and really linked that to some of the domestic struggles. I mean, today I kind of bifurcate myself in a way. I work a lot on issues related to police violence and issues of protester rights. And our work in Charlottesville, I work with a group of lawyers. Our work in Charlottesville in so many ways was such a good example where our country is failing folks that are fighting for social justice, that are crying out for social justice. And then the other part of my work when I'm not doing that, when there isn't an uprising in a place like Ferguson or in Baltimore, I work with children and I work with people who work with children to really help us be able to communicate better around issues of difference. Many, many people believe that children are born not seeing difference, right? Not being exposed, if you will, to these ill of seeing difference. And yet that is actually the opposite. Children are born understanding difference pretty well. It's biological, it's evolutionary, it's critical, it's important. I know people love those memes where, you see a little black child and a little white child and they're hugging and they're kissing. And then the narration is, see, they don't see difference. Yeah. And that's actually not true. They do see difference. They just do not put judgment on difference. That comes later. And so really helping folks to see what children need in order to become these inclusive, wonderful human beings that we're trying to grow is the other part of my work. And I think it's so important. I have had people say to me, oh, you used to run an international, well-known, branded organization, and now you're working with kids. And I think, of course, this is such an important part of the journey for me. I remember working in a city in the US and going to a low-income neighborhood and talking with kids there about some violence that had taken place, some police violence that had taken place. And then I went to a prep school, a private school, talked to children of the same age. We're really talking about first graders in both places. And both sets of children were traumatized and both sets of children were scared. And no adult was really offering any sort of opportunity for open conversation with either group of children. Mm. And I thought, how sad. Often people say, wow, that seems really different. You're doing these two different things, but I'm seeing these things as being so connected to each other. Our little children grow up to be police officers that shoot children with, toy guns. And we have African-American girls growing up to be profiled in schools. There has to be conversations from the very beginning. Really, our society is depending upon it right now.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's a great segue to start to get into the EPIC guideposts. And the first one, E, stands for engage mindfully with our children. Knowing that I wish that we could have this be like a 2 or 3 hour conversation. But if you were to share, the most essential thing you've learned that would help us as mothers, many of us are white women of privilege like me who listen to the podcast. What do you feel like we most need to know or start to do to help our children be more aware?
I think the first part is helping your children being aware of who they are. Explaining to your children that they are white, for example, for white moms with white kids, is a very difficult thing for people. The words aren't hard. Like I could literally write the script, but yet having those words come out of one's mouth, everything in our society has told us that is wrong. And part of it is because we Americans aren't very good at nuance, meaning one does not have to say, we are white and therefore we are the best. Like that is not a good message. But to describe what whiteness is, that yes, there are brown people, because children actually don't love the word black. They like the word brown because they're literal. So they like to talk about colors. There are brown people. Your children may say, I'm not white, I'm pink.
That's exactly
let's go with
let's with my 5-year-old.
Exactly. And it's great. Let's go with that too. But let's talk about it. And let's get out crayons and let's get out paints and let's talk about what you're seeing instead of saying, shh. The term, the word, whatever, the sound shh is my least favorite sound because oftentimes we are shushing, not for them, but for us. because we're embarrassed. I tell a story often when I train that I remember walking down the street with my daughter, and a Black man was walking on the other side of the street, and she was 4 years old at the time, and she points at him and yells, "Mommy, look at that Black man." I'm Black. And I was mortified. But because I've been doing this work, I knew what the appropriate response was, not to tell her to be quiet, but to have that conversation with her. Now, also, I said to the man, "She's learning about race." So I was like, "Hey, sorry about that." But actually, that wasn't even what was happening, to be quite frank. She was actually referring to his jacket and his pants that were actually the color black. So that was, but yet I could not have found that out if I was shushing her. I had to be willing to let it happen and then to have the conversation with her so I could find out what she was thinking. Now, here's the thing about all this that I find such a blessing about talking with your children about inclusion and diversity is that it makes her trust me when I'm willing to have a conversation. Because here's the thing, our kids actually know what our emotion is before we actually really know. Like, while our brain is still processing it, our children, again, this is evolutionary, are like, whoa, I've just embarrassed him or her. And depending upon whether they think that's funny or not is how often it happens, right? But they actually know that you're embarrassed. And then they also know that, oh, she was embarrassed, but she didn't yell. She didn't tell me to be quiet. She actually listened to me, and I got to say my truth. Now imagine 5-10 years of doing that with your child. So when they're 14 and they're at a party and drugs are being floated around and their gut tells them that's not right, they want to know that they can follow their gut because it's okay, because you've taught them that, because even when they do things that are a little bit embarrassing to you, it's still okay. And you've also shown them that when something's going down that isn't maybe all that great, that they can come to you. Imagine which parents get the call saying, "Can you come get me?"
Right.
Imagine which parents get the calls. And that's why I think in some ways, the more we can engage with them, as difficult as it is on these issues, the dividends that it pays off. And I've talked to parents who've been a part of these research studies, and I've talked to them now that their kids are 25 and 30, and they've said, I didn't realize talking to my kid about homophobia would mean when he lost his job and wasn't sure what to do, instead of, going to the bar, or instead of doing something self-destructive, he knew he could call me. And so I think actually the work should be done for society's sake and because we know that it's the right thing. But I also love to just say, let's link that to the other ways that we're engaging mindfully. And oftentimes when you are engaging mindfully on other issues, talking about diversity and inclusion actually is just an obvious extension.
Yeah. You did this webinar about courageous conversation with children, and I believe you're going to be also running a class soon, which we'll include links to. But one of the things you said that I really appreciated was, holding a growth mindset around our conversation about race. And there's a lot in the education world about the importance of a growth mindset, where children know that their knowledge is not fixed and that it's actually safe and good to fail and make mistakes. And that's how we learn. And I loved just holding that perspective about this kind of conversation, both for myself, to give myself permission to make mistakes as I talk about these things, but then to also hold that space for my children.
Yeah, I mean, that's a part of why we have to get out of this whole shushing and kind of putting these issues to the side mindset. Because when we do that, what we're actually telling children is not, don't think about these things, don't talk about these things. We're really telling them, don't talk about these things to me. Don't talk about these things to adults. And then so who are they talking about them to? Well, up until about 10, they're really going to just talk to themselves, amongst themselves, with no real direction. And I've seen this happen on the playground, where you have kids kind of go over to the side to talk about an issue of race, or if there's a transgender child in their class, to talk about these different issues, not getting any perspective or context or even facts, but they're going to talk to themselves about it. And then by 10 years old, they literally begin to act upon what is in our society, which are some fairly racist, homophobic, and transphobic beliefs. And so, yeah, I mean, a part of this is understanding that it is okay for them not to get it right from the beginning, but that it's important that you be there to help them along the way. In my work, what I've seen is when people start this at a young age, 3 and 4, with their children, they're very likely not going to have the incidents that some parents have in junior high, where they get a call saying, hey, your daughter's been drawing swastikas at school. We're going to need you to come in part because there's been guidance and context given to some of these issues. But even when that does happen, it's still about a growth mindset. And what's really hard in our society is we do a lot of shaming very quickly. So the messages that we get as parents is don't talk about race, don't talk about difference. But if your child messes up, you must be a neo-Nazi. And that's just not what happens, to be really honest with you. And I'll give an example, Dylan Roof, who went into the church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed ministers and Bible study worshipers, one of which was a very good friend of mine's cousin. So very close to that. When that happened, everybody said, oh, this child is just an aberration. This Dylan Roof, who were his parents? What were his parents like? And to be honest, his parents really weren't a lot different than a lot of other parents. They were parents that weren't engaged on these issues, or parents that didn't talk to him about it. And when he began to have some of these racist feelings and ideologies, they looked the other way. Similarly to what happened in Charlottesville, the mother said, I try not to talk to him about politics. And so in some ways, our society gives that as the option instead of, again, engaging in this growth mindset, understanding that there's constantly going to be battles that your child is going to face. The child's living in a society as well. And you can actually be a very progressive person and have a child who says, you know what, I don't like this or that group for a variety of reasons. Without having a growth mindset, well, then I guess it's just over, right? Then you've now raised a racist at 12. No, that's not the way to think about it. The way to think about it is the way we think about a lot of parenting, which is, yeah, you got that math problem wrong. We're going to do it again, right? We have a growth mindset when it comes to math. I mean, to a certain degree, people struggle with that as well. But think about it. When your child's learning addition, when they get something wrong, you don't say, oh, well, you're never going to be able to balance a checkbook. You say, no, go do it again. Yeah. And we need to be thinking that way also around inclusion and diversity issues.
This is so great. Thank you for all of that. I'm wondering, I know also, and you referred to this earlier, about how much our children learn by what they see in us. So if we move on to the P in EPIC, which is about passionate and purposeful work in the world, I'm also really curious about what you think are the most important actions that we can take as adults to show them that, that these are issues that matter to us. What would be your advice for me or other mothers listening that are ready to step into some more advocacy and allyship about where we can make the most impact?
Yeah, so my bottom line around these issues as it relates to our children is we really need to make sure that we are constantly expressing our values to them in an age-appropriate way. I want to talk about expressing our values first, and then I'll talk about age-appropriate. When I say expressing our values, I don't mean when you have the radio on and you hear something horrible that has just happened, you say, oh, God. Like, you can say that, you can say whatever you need to say, but that is not expressing our values. In any moment that you have when something is happening, it is important, especially as your children begin to also listen to the radio and listen to the news, to say, we don't espouse that and we don't believe in that. I'll use the transgender bathroom bill in North Carolina. Absolutely, at a certain age, your child is going to know what that means. And for some children, it's earlier than others because they have friends who are transgendered. For you to say, literally say to them, this is not right and we don't agree. That's not what our family agrees with. That is not our family values. What do you think, child, we should do about this? Is a very powerful tool. I love a march and I love a protest. I actually think sometimes it's more powerful because what you are doing is once more explaining, hey, we don't roll like that. Just like, you don't let your child do many, many, many things because they're either illegal or inappropriate. This is also something that we're just not for. When you have a younger child, maybe that doesn't have all the details, it's still an opportunity to have a conversation about, you know what? Good people share. Good people care about people. Good people are kind. Do you think we're good people? Yeah, mommy, daddy, I think we're good people. That's a conversation that you can have with a 3 and a 4-year-old. In some ways as well, especially if you're frustrated, and I wrote about this a couple weeks ago, Your children know when you hear something and you are frustrated. They might not know why you're frustrated, but they understand, oh, there's this frustration and it is unexplained. And there are times where we're so upset about things going on in the news, even for our youngest children, even for our 2-year-olds. If we're watching the flooding, for example, that has taken place in Houston, if we're watching that and we're crying and our 2-year-olds come up to us and I want to know what's wrong, it's actually better to tell them that what's wrong and that it's external to them versus allowing them to try to figure out what's going on with you. So really that expression part, age appropriate, again, just to say, children learn about these issues much earlier than we think, right? So I had a first grader last year and she would come home with information about Donald Trump that shocked me. And yet she's thinking about it. She's hearing it and she's thinking about it. So then what is my role? Again, my role is to express our values to her in a way that she can understand, refute garbage, because our kids hear a lot of things that are incorrect, refute the garbage, and make them know that you are still, and I use this term, a reliable reporter. And a reporter, what I mean is that, think about it. We all have our preference of where we get our news from. Why? Why is that your preference? Often it's because we think that the people that we like are telling more truth, right? You want your child to believe that you are the most reliable reporter they know. Until you can't get away with that anymore when they get a little bit older, but you still want them to know, you know what? If I talk to her and I ask her, I'm going to get the real deal. I'm going to get some understanding. I'm going to walk away knowing more than I did before. In many ways, children literally are walking computers. They just want to get more information so they can process it and get results. And so really thinking about how can you make sure that you're doing that is so important. Certainly some folks, do like to take their children to protests, and I think those things can be fine and they can be really important. My daughter just decided that she wanted to make signs a couple of days ago to let people know that some of the things that Donald Trump was saying isn't nice. That's great. We took them around the neighborhood to people that we knew would, be welcoming to her. So for a 7-year-old, that makes a lot of sense. So there's other actions, but the action has to begin with you, again, expressing your values in an age-appropriate way.
Yeah. A couple times on the podcast, I've been also stepping into more activism in general in a way that I haven't before in my life. And a couple times the quote from Audre Lorde about self-care being a radical act has come up. And as you were talking, I was thinking that, so I think so many of us are feeling called to step into more activism and to also look at our privilege and to step into becoming an ally, maybe in a way we haven't before. So we think that maybe that means like we should be at protest. But as you were just talking, this idea of like really talking about these issues with our children and engaging with our children is maybe one of the most radical acts.
Definitely, because everything in our society tells us not to, that somehow that they'll just get it. And that's not the case. And again, I spend a lot of time at protests myself, so I'm not against that, but it does not take the place of doing some of the hardest things. And for parents, sometimes it's just, we don't actually want to be the one to let our child know that the world is far, far, far from perfect. After becoming a parent, I realized like, oh my gosh, I have a little person who I'm going to have to tell them that not too far off in the future, someone is going to treat them badly simply because they have this beautiful brown skin I'm looking at. That is very, very hard. And I think we come up with all sorts of reasons why we're not going to have the conversations because the conversation's so hard. And so once we can have the conversation, we can actually have more effective protests. We can have more transformational moments together if we're willing to do that hard part first.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I've decided that I wanted to have this podcast conversation and this initiative that I'll link called Women Podcasters in Solidarity, where I want to encourage other women podcasters to use their platform for these kinds of conversations. A lot of different things have happened, but one is I saw a video that you may have seen or at least heard about of Black parents having that conversation with their children about, what happens if a police officer pulls them over and, in many ways kind of having to take away the innocence that they have about how people see them in the world. And it was heartbreaking to watch. And so, I do think this awareness about how people, even people that are revered, like police officers, see, how they're affected by racism.
Mm-hmm.
It's important and something I want to be a part of shifting. And so, the next guidepost, I invested in ourselves. I actually want to ask you instead, if we are to be investing in shifting the relationship with police in communities of color and the way that our criminal justice system is set up, and if we're going to invite, community members and listeners to contribute to causes that can begin to do that shifting, where do you think we should be investing?
I'm very pro investing in one's communities or communities close to them. Meaning, I work with a lot of national organizations and I think that they're great. I think that many of them are great. Some of them maybe not so much, but most of them are pretty great. But this issue of policing is going to be fought and won on a local level. And, so if you live in a suburb that is mostly white, what is the city that's closest to you? What is the nature of policing? What problems have there been? I can guarantee you there have been problems. Even in suburban areas, what are the issues that you're facing? What are the issues that Black and brown folks are facing with the police? Being willing to ask questions, being willing to stand in solidarity. I'm absolutely familiar with the video that you're talking about, Julie, and I watched it and used it in trainings many times. And the thing that still strikes me is that, think about it this way: if Black and brown parents can have these conversations with their children are no less innocent than white children, right? There's this phenomenon called adultification, where oftentimes white people believe brown and Black children to be older than they actually are. And so they'll use language that is much more appropriate for adults on things that children do. There's also in the way that we think about talking about police. So, some folks say, well, Black folks have to talk to their kids about police because they have to, because that keeps them alive. You know what else keeps Black kids alive? When their white friends know that when they do things, there could be an effect upon their Black friends. I've had training situations where mothers have said, well, I have a 16-year-old white boy, so I don't have to be worried about this. And I've said, well, does he have any Black or brown friends? Well, of course he does. Okay, well, they drive in the car together. Oh, yeah, they drive in the car together all the time. Well, then actually you have a really important role, and your child plays a really important role in those moments. And so, I really think that looking at where we are locally, thinking about our own neighborhood, thinking about our children's kids, thinking about the issues that are impacting parents of color, and saying, you know what, I can do some of that work. We need to have another meeting with the sheriff, or we need to have another meeting with the police commission. I can do some of that work. I can help out. I don't have to be in the front, right? I don't have to lead it, but I can help take some of that burden and take off some of that load. And as we hear about issues that are national around policing, stop saying that you can't talk to your uncle about it at the dinner table, even if he is a police officer, because you really can. You really can. It's hard, but you really can. And believe me, because I think Julie knows this, but I haven't said on the podcast that I'm biracial. So I have family members who feel all different kinds of ways about both politics and policing. I've had to have those hard conversations. Now, some folks would say I have more skin in the game, but isn't that the issue, right? Isn't that the issue? Figuring out what we're willing to give up, how we're privileged, and how we're, and what we are willing to give up for what we know is right. So locally, with your family, with folks that may not agree with you, being willing to have those conversations and asking those hard questions, I think is the most important investment.
Yeah. I notice I have to get my kids to school, and I know you had to go too. And I feel like we could have so much more conversation, and maybe there'll be an opportunity for part 2. I know there will be an opportunity to have you come and continue the conversation and answer some questions inside the private Mother's Quest Facebook group, which people can join, and we'll include links for that. And so maybe we'll start there with the C in EPIC, which is about being connected to a strong support system. And you can share a little bit about, how we can build connections and community across our differences. But now I think before we close, I want to give you an opportunity to give me a challenge or offer a resource to help further my own exploration on this path that I can offer to those in the community that want to say yes as well to the challenge. What would be the thing you think I should do?
We all have a conversation that we've needed to have with one or more of our children that we've been waiting on. And my challenge is to think about why. Why are we waiting? Is it not the right time? Maybe it's not the right time. Is it because we're uncomfortable? Most likely that has something to do with it. That my challenge is to process that, to work through that, to think about why it is, and to really highlight that and figure out if it truly is about our child not being ready, or is it about us not being ready? Mm-hmm. And if it's not about us, let's get ready. Let's get ready quickly. Let's find the resources. Let's find the people. Let's really think about what we would need to have an effective conversation with our child. And then let's have it.
Great. Yeah. And I feel like for me, with both of my kids, I have a 5-year-old and a 13-year-old. So they're in very different places. I feel like I've started the conversation, but I think I can deepen it. So I will do some more introspection, and I'll figure out in both of those cases what's the sort of next level of the conversation that I've been waiting to have, but I will get ready and then move into it. And then I'll commit to being able to report when we have that Facebook conversation in the group, some of the conversation that I've had with my kids.
That's awesome.
And so then before we officially close, I always like to end with acknowledgements, which is just an opportunity for each of us to share what our biggest takeaways are from the conversation. And I can start. I think, again, I had an affirmation of that it's actually not as hard as I think to reach out to somebody like you and to be honest and to risk imperfection. I feel like you were just so gracious and generous, and I really appreciate it. I'm committed to just continuing to be in some of the discomfort and holding this growth mindset around conversations with race. I really appreciate you raising that. And I think my other just big takeaway from this time together is just the importance of courageous conversation. How much, the not to shush both the instinct or ideas or things that might come up for me in opportunities for conversation with adults, and then certainly with our children, the importance of opening channels of communication around these topics from an early age.
Yeah, for me, it's also an affirmation as well. I mean, we've got this. We really can do this as folks living in the United States and in Canada. And I'm sure you've got folks listening to your podcast around the world. I mean, we have some real societal ills, and they're impacting our day to day, no matter who you are, really, at this point. No matter what your background is, no matter what your identity is, you cannot escape some of the real harsh realities of the society that we live in, and some of the real hate that we're seeing. And yet we've got this. We can do this. Like, the universe is not asking us to do anything that is not within our grasp. It's not easy, but we can get it done. So I feel great about that.
Well, thank you for being part of, just a catalyst for helping us realize that and helping us know what steps we can begin to take.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day, Nicole.
Thank you. You too, Julie.
Thank you so much for coming along with me on this episode of the Mother's Quest podcast. I hope this conversation sparked something that will help you live your epic life. If you'd like to get show notes and learn more about how to join the Mother's Quest community, head over to mothersquest.com. And while you're there, I would love it if you would follow the prompts to subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, and help us spread the word. I want to end with some words to light the way on your quest. Seize the day, love your people, honor your gifts. Until next time.